I'm handing it over to our friends Stuart and Bobby, who are also advisors in with this project, and they will introduce themselves and present on information governance records management. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Bobby and I want to acknowledge that we are in BC, located on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Coquitlam peoples. Today, we're going to cover 5 topics: standards and best practices, profiling, information form of governance, which we'll refer to as IG, records and information forms of management, which we'll call RIM, and we'll be asking you a question in the chat on that, and admin data. Our understanding is that each SGIG is at a different stage of their maturity regarding data forms of governments and RIM, and that some SGIGs have RIM and programs and others don't. Our intention in our webinar today is to paint a picture for you of what can be and what is being achieved by SGIGs across the country.
So today, Stuart and I have a lot of experience with records and information management. And we have been working with, as Harmony said before, we are expert advisors for this project, and we are also working with ARMA International, which is the Professional Association for Records Management, and the First Nations Public Sector Service Secretariat with their Management Training Academy's Curriculum Advisory Committee for Records Management Content for Indigenous governments in Canada.
On this slide, we ask, what are standards? What are best practices? Why use standards and best practices? And on the Data Governance Toolkit website, there's a web page that is currently under development where you will be able to get downloadable documents that provide you with a list of best practices and standards. On this slide, you see at the bottom in orange, a link to ARMA, which has a good set of standards and best practices that you may wish to review. As the slide shows, a standard is an agreed to, proven best way of doing something that's accepted by a business sector that also applies the wisdom and experience of experts. A best practice is a commercial or professional method, technique, or procedure accepted or prescribed as being most effective. Best practices identify and use applicable standards. The slide also shows some standard producing organizations on the top right. The International Organization for Standardization, also known as ISO, and the Canadian General Standards Board's CGSB. Now, to date, there is no data governance standard, but there are lots of records management and information standards. On the bottom right of the slide, it also shows you some of the best practices. We have the DAMA Book of Knowledge, or DMBOK, and the information and governance best practices called ARMA, the IG Book of Knowledge, or IGBOK. Why use standards and best practices? In a word, the answer is success. Bobby and I are great fans of standards and best practices because they're also very useful. They give you a trusted framework that allows you to get creative using the framework to solve your practical problems. In addition, they can be evidence of your legal compliance in the event of an audit, investigation, or litigation. They can protect you from lawsuits. Standards and best practices can also fill in gaps in the law. The law of records in Canada is not well developed. There are few record statutes, and the case law from the courts is still developing. Using standards and best practices can reduce your risk of doing things wrong, and it gives you the comfort that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you start a project or program. Using standards and best practices allows us to benefit from the wisdom and experience of experts. They also allow us to have compatibility with other forms of governments and organizations that are involved in your business. This is important when negotiating government to government, since other forms of government in Canada use standards and best practices a great deal in their business. In all, standards and best practices increase your efficiency and effectiveness, and that saves you time and money. This slide shows you a screenshot from the DG website. It provides an introduction to information forms of governance and management and administrative data. Now, this slide gives you the formalized definition of IG from ARMA's IG BOC. The definition emphasizes a cross-disciplinary framework, standards, accountability to achieve business objectives, prove compliance, and minimize risk. Now, IG does matter. It gives you a framework of rules and practices that ensures compliance with ARMA's 8 generally accepted record-keeping principles. The following 8 principles form the records management portion of IG. First, being accountable for care and quality of records. Being transparent about how records are managed. Demonstrating integrity by being moral, ethical, and honest. Actively protecting records with fireproof cabinets, scanning, and IT backups. Proving compliance by meeting legal retention requirements, adopting standards and best practices. Ensuring availability, being able to produce records for audits, privacy requests, or for legal proceedings. Applying retentions, which identify required legal or business retentions, and storing records for those time periods. And the 8th and final principle is conducting disposition. So when Bobby and I are talking about disposition, we're talking about one of 3 decisions made about the records at the end of the life cycle. One is the decision to destroy the record beyond reconstruction, or transfer that record to permanent business storage, or finally, succession to a third-party archive.
In this slide, you're going to see the graphic for what is information governance. And it shows you all of the areas of a government that would be involved in information governance. So you have your representation from your departments, which is considered your business. You've got privacy and security, you have IT, you have RIM, and you have legal. There are 5 roles working together to create and manage records flowing in a life cycle, which is the center of the graphic. If you don't see your government in this graphic, it's okay. This graphic was created for really large, typically US and European companies. And what we find is the most important takeaway is that you customize the graphic to represent your government.
And you use what facilities or people you have on hand as a starting point. And then over time, as you get more mature in your program, then you can develop more roles as you see fit.
So what we've done with this example is we've said, we don't see data management in our information governance circle. So we've added that section of the pie. And I know that with Indigenous governments, leadership and community has a lot more influence than you would have in a regular municipality. So it's a special government. So I think we need to create an information governance graphic that reflects the Indigenous government.
So as you start your journey with DG, self-assessment is an important first step. Knowing where you're starting from allows you to measure your success and benchmark your metrics. The DG Toolkit has a useful self-assessment tool for DM. On the second line on that slide on the left-hand side, the FNPSS has a IM Toolkit for RIM. The FNPSS is also developing a self-assessment tool for RIM, which will be available soon on their website. As well, ARMA has the IG maturity model, which is a standard records self-assessment tool. And there are 5 levels of maturity. The screen on the right-hand side is too small to read, I think, but I'll just give you a brief overview of the different levels, beginning with level 1. Level 1 means you're just starting out, that you don't have all the elements of your program in place yet. Level 2 means that your records management program is developing, but legal compliance may not be proven. Level 3 is essential, which means your RIM program is working well and you have minimal problems with compliance and efficiency. Level 4 is where you're being proactive, where IG is working well on the whole organization and IG is routinely integrated into the business. And finally, level 5 means your government is transformational and a leader in IG. Now, as Bobby mentioned before, this is a corporate model which we customized to the specific needs of the organization. And in our I guess I've got 20 years, you've got over 10 years, various clients working with records. We see that most of our clients are varying between level 1, 2, or 3. We have not yet seen a level 4 or level 5 organization.
This is a graphic that I designed when I was trying to think through how I could show you how information governance and data governance fit together. So the circles that you see mid-screen across, you'll see business units, privacy and security, IT, risk, RIM, data management, and legal. Those represent what we had in the customized information governance graphic. And then below them, you're going to see two very different work functions, one of records management and one of data management. And then below that, you're going to see the sources of where both records management records are coming from and where data management data could be coming from. So baseline data, administrative data from the band office or your executive offices, third-party data such as StatsCan, third-party health data, community data by surveys, university researchers. So I hope that this helps define for you that there is a difference between the two of them, and they both have governance protocols.
So the next 3 slides show you a practical way that you can follow to leverage governance and business profiling as part of your IG process. This slide covers governance profiling. We first need to profile your government to find out what law applies to you, what you have to do to comply with that law, as well as your own laws. Profiling is a useful tool because it can allow you to identify legal gaps as well. Since SGIGs have the power to create their own laws, we recommend that they legislate what records to create and how long to retain them. By doing so, this makes the disposition phase of the life cycle of the record easier, since the law would clearly prescribe for how long to retain the records. Also on the slide is a fictional example that is based on a common line of business that we've seen in SGIGs and other First Nations organizations. The Selingta government provides medical transport services to their citizens. Citizens are reimbursed for their expenses when they seek medical treatment outside their territories. Medical transport records typically contain citizens' personal information, including information about their medical condition. Now, Selingta has its own privacy laws, but the medical transport services are funded by provincial health authority, and the health authority must comply with the provincial privacy law. And what links the two together is they have a written funding agreement between the health authority and Selingta, which requires Selingta to comply with the provincial privacy law, not their own privacy law. So if a citizen has a complaint about how Selingta manages the citizen's personal information regarding medical transport, because of the funding agreement, Selingta must apply the provincial privacy law, not its own law. If Selingta applies the wrong law, they risk being in the wrong court and they could lose legal rights, not to mention the cost and time and money spent. There's a growing body of case law across the country where courts are being asked to determine what law applies: provincial law, territorial law, federal law, SGIG law. And the most common cases we're seeing are unjust dismissal cases from employment, workplace safety, and human rights. Addressing legal jurisdiction at the outset using profiling increases the SGIG's legal compliance and reduces the risk of errors and having to spend time and money.
So this slide shows you a governance profile for Selingta, and it observes all of the areas of law that could be coming into the government. And it allows you to consider different types of legislation. So for example, you'll notice that human rights is not in there. But it's important to understand how your agreements that you have with external governments or parties can impact the legal requirements around how your records are handled.
Moving on to business profiling, it allows you to understand how your records and information forms of management are impacted by the agreements your your governments have entered into with other entities. Now, best practice is to include what records under the agreement need to be created, who owns the records, and for how long they should be retained.
This graphic shows you a business profiling for Salingatuk. So it basically starts to define the government in an org chart style, and it shows centers of influence from community to deputy chief and council or executive leadership, and carries on through to the administrative offices and then the operational offices at the bottom. And when you define the services that are provided in your business model to your citizens, then you start having a better idea of the types of records and data that can be found in each of those departments. Then we go even further and we look for different types of software, because that's where our electronic records are going to be, and how many drives you have, and how user workspaces and user experience interfaces are designed.
Also, what this allows you to do using maps, charts, and tables, it's a good way to test your assumptions, because you may say, well, we do back up all of our computers in any format. And then if you do your business profile, you can see in the top right that not all of those electronic not all of those computers are being backed up. And that's a concern, because without backups, we don't have the security for the data or for the protection. And we find with clients, this is a very useful exercise, because there are a lot of assumptions that folks have. And then once they go and do the profiling, they find out that they've got new information they didn't know they had, or they don't have the information that they assumed that they had. Administrative data are information created and maintained by Indigenous governments for the purposes of carrying out various business functions, but not for statistical programs. We have a list of administrative types that we've drafted where you can find administrative data. You can use this list to assist you in your research. I understand Allison has put the link, or will be putting the link for the document in the chat. So this slide asks the question, where are my paper records? Typically, they're in a range of places. We've listed some of the places our clients have their records stored. As you can see, the locations vary from the government buildings to private homes. Bobby and I are not fans of storing records in sea containers. Paper records are like people. They need air to breathe and can't live safely in spaces where it's too hot or too cold. Most sea containers are too hot in the summer and too cold in winter. As a result, often records stored in sea containers are damaged and deteriorate over time.
The same risks exist also with offsite storage units, where the temperatures are erratic, and you can find that the records are deteriorating through mold, silverfish, water damage, and you're at a risk of theft with offsite storage units.
Like with paper records, there are many places your electronic records could be stored. As we mentioned before, the first place you're going to find electronic records is on computer drives or C drives, or if you have a network shared drive. You'll also find records on portable, non-encrypted thumb drives. Records stored on portable, non-encrypted thumb drives are at a high risk of being lost or stolen, which can create issues with reputation and community trust. As a result, it's not a best practice to use portable thumb drives. But if you have to use them, use an encrypted thumb drive that can be locked in a government safe. Line of business software like accounting software may run reports. These reports are very useful because they can provide you with specific data sets. Electronic records can also live in the cloud. This is an increasing feature of a lot of businesses around the country. Cloud storage and software as a service can be fickle by nature, in that you're giving up the physical custodies of your records to a third party. Governments may want to mitigate their risk by ensuring that a copy of those records are also backed up onto the government's on-premise servers. Now, this slide shows our first steps in mapping electronic records across an Indigenous landscape. We want to know what software is being used by each of the departments and what types of records are stored in them.
So this is an aerial street map of the Salingatuk administrative buildings and roads. And you'll see over on the right-hand side, there's a yellow circle with a number in it, and that's for how many bankers' boxes are stored on site. The second is a green square that shows the paper records that have well-being data in them. And then there is also an icon for line of business software. So as you can see, we've been very detailed about identifying which of the departments are running out of which building and where the paper records are versus where we're going to be able to find well-being records throughout the administration.
As well, doing an aerial view gives you a sense of where your records are. And if you have in your government records stored across your territory where you're needing to drive, knowing what's in the specific departments might save you a drive and will save you time and money if you can identify beforehand that there are no well-being data in particular areas.
Now we're going to transition over to records management. So the First Nations Public Service Secretariat is has a best practice for Indigenous governments for their records and information management toolkit. So that basically will support you in further developing or establishing a records management program. They also provide records and information management training through webinars. That's a really good online resource for you to be able to build capacity and understand everything that's involved in doing records management in a formal way in your government.
This section gives a high-level overview of RIM. As we mentioned, RIM is part of IG. RIM is an essential function for DG. RIM also provides a structure on how information is handled in both electronic and paper formats. And almost every organization that we've been working with has some form of paper and electronic. Increasingly, clients are moving to more electronic than paper, but I'm not confident in my career that we will see the end of paper and the creation of the paperless office. Whether paper or electronic, RIM follows a life cycle. The slide shows a graphic from ARMA from the beginning of the life cycle, which is the records capture. Then there's collaboration, version control, retention and storage, legal holds and discovery, and finally, disposition or archiving. What's interesting is that the RIM record lifecycle is very similar to the DG lifecycle. So we typically apply the life cycle of a record or data in 3 stages. We first create the record, that's the creator. Later, we may need to find the record, that's the second stage, the activity of the seeker. Third and finally, at the end of the life cycle, the record or data is disposed of by the dispositionist. And we apply discernment throughout. The goal is to get the right information to the right people at the right time. A record is information that is evidence of business or legal activities, and a record can be in any format. Formats vary. We've given you a common list of record formats, from agreements through to books, documents, letters, manuals, maps, videos, vouchers, down to wax cylinders. Now, a question for the chat. Is data a record? Anybody on the chat for that? Harmony, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think data is a record?
I am going, oh, Mark's in there before me.
Okay, well, let's get his views.
I'm grateful for Mark.
This is not a test. There's no right or wrong answer. It's your own experience.
So can you tell us what Mark is saying?
Mark is saying he guesses no. And then my brother Dylan says indubitably it is. And Sandra says no, but records are data. Jennifer says yes, data is a record. Data can also be used to create a record. That was kind of what I was thinking. Yes, I believe it is. When I think of data, I think about a collection of records. And then someone else says no, as data changes frequently, which is also a good point.
That's a great representation of our experience with the answer to that question, because from a records perspective, a record is something you need for regular business. So you could have data that's not needed for a legal requirement, for audit, or would not be required for your business. Or the data could be, depending on, again, what is the context of that particular information.
And that is where discernment is coming in.
Right. So there's a statement or a principle we have in RIM that says all documents, and I'd include data in this, all data, all documents are information. All records are documents or data, but not all data is a record. And the distinction that we work with in RIM is that, is it required for legal? And if it's not, is it required for business? If it's not, then it's not a record. It's either data or information or a document.
So that was a trick question.
Not really. It's to try and get us thinking through what is valuable and important for the information that we're collecting as a business.
We got some good stuff going in the chat, so I'm not the one who asked the trick question thing. That's pretty clever.
Well, if there's any blame us.
Next slide. So this is a really important graphic, and it's a logic graphic, and it can be found in the FNPSS RIM Toolkit, and it is really supportive in working through in your mind, defining what is and what is not a record. And you're going to see the term creator again in there, and it's going to allow you to have discussions with people on your teams about what is and what is not a record. And so I would encourage you to definitely go and get a copy of the IM Toolkit so that you've got tools like this for debates like, is data a record?
And it's free on the FNS website. And as well, we've had clients report that they'll take this particular record logic map and they'll customize it for other questions they may have in their organization. So you may have something like, is this data? And then have the logic map go from the first stage through to your decision stage.
And this is also a really great map to start engaging leadership with, right? Because they're able to sit down and work it through on their own and then be able to sit down and have a conversation. So the question is, what is in a RIM program? What do we want to have for a formalized RIM program? So everyone does records management. If we didn't, we wouldn't be in business. But to formalize a program brings awareness and cohesiveness inside of a government. And it sees the importance for documentation and formalization and training. So the very first step that we would want to start with is some sort of an authorizing document that would authorize the program. And the reason that you want to authorize your program formally is, number one, it's a primary indicator of general capacity and leadership buy-in. Then you want to pass a RIM policy and have it drafted so that it represents the framework of your entire program. And then the next step would be to draft a classification plan and retention schedule. So that is basically a numeric, functionally based inventory of every single workflow in every single department of the government. And the retention portion on it is, does it have a business and or legal retention period? So that's super important, because you can't truly do legal disposition without those 3 steps in place. And then the next step would be to draft a records management procedures manual. And in that manual, you would have your workflows around records. You would have a scanning program formalized using ISO standards and ISO target quality controls to ensure that the equipment is working properly. You would have a disposition program that's formalized with certificates. You would have an email training program so that everyone speaks the same language about how you're going to manage email, department acronym lists, naming conventions that are prescriptive, and of course a glossary so that everyone from IT to RIM are speaking the same language. And if you do all of this together, that's information governance. But you also need to add a lot of training for records management for staff and leadership and change management.
And the basic premise is the more complicated your business, the more complicated your record keeping is likely to be. In this slide, we talk about how RIM can support DM. Now, on the previous slide, we showed you the IG reference model, which has the 5 roles. We're going to profile 3 of them, the RIM, the legal, and the IT. So these are just some ideas that we have around how RIM can support DM. RIM could help draft the DM section of the classification plan. RIM and legal could work cooperatively together to define legal and business retentions. RIM could also support DM by drafting policies, procedures, guidelines, and workflows. RIM is very good at creating forms, templates, and spreadsheets, and naming conventions as well, which we'll have a couple slides on in a moment. Also, RIM can define the format of the official record, whether it's going to be in paper or in electronic for the DM records. And maybe some DM records might be in paper, some might be electronic. And finally, RIM can identify locations of data using records mapping. We've already shown you a number of examples of how you might want to be creative about that. The previous slide introduced how RIM can support data management with a naming convention. A naming convention is simply an agreed-upon format of labeling an electronic record. The creator of the record applies a naming convention to the record the first time it's saved. The naming convention allows the seeker to know what the document is without having to open the document. And the naming convention in this way is the seeker's most powerful and best tool for finding records. This is a fictional example of a naming convention for an SGIG for a data reporting record. The example on the top of the slide has 9 elements. This gives the seeker many choices to use to search. Seeker can search by CPRS primary number or by date, by title of the document, search by SGIG name or department name, search by version, search by author, or finally search by status or status version date. Now the file name for this data reporting record has 95 characters. Most computer systems have a limit of 256 characters for the file name. So that's done so that the system can properly save the record and make it available for future retrieval by the seeker. It's a best practice for you to keep your naming convention character lengths as short as possible. The slide also shows how you could create naming conventions for working records and the finalized records. The key takeaway with naming conventions is they're highly customizable by department, by organization, and they're very flexible and a very powerful tool to access electronic records. Legal counsel can support data management in a number of ways. If you don't have legal counsel available to you, then most organizations at some point will hire outside counsel if there's no in-house counsel. Legal can draft memorandum of understanding and other information sharing agreements. There's a page on agreements on the Data Governance Toolkit webpage. Legal can ensure agreements are legally enforceable in court, specify who's the record owner, how the records or data will be used, how long the data will be retained for business or legal purposes, and they can also define records retentions with RIM. For example, Bobby and I have a client whose band office staff has reported oral histories for their elders for use in research. The program has been going on for years. The program works so the elder signs a consent form allowing my client to use their stories. My client got an email from a lawyer from another First Nation asking that the transcripts for these oral histories be provided to the other First Nation in order to sue the government of Canada. The requested transcripts were from over 20 years ago. My client asked me, can we disclose the transcripts for litigation purposes? I didn't have an answer, I didn't know. So my client and I worked together. My client did some digging for records and I did the legal research. My client found the original signed consent forms from over 20 years ago. On the consent form is a statement saying the elder consented for the oral history to be used for research and quote, any other use required by the First Nation, including asserting legal rights, end quote. Now, since the consent form clearly contemplated litigation and also allowed the First Nation to decide how to use the information, my client was authorized by the elders to disclose their personal information in the transcripts to the other lawyer for a secondary purpose being litigation. Having signed consent forms meant my client had evidence to prove the client was legally permitted to disclose in case anybody was going to challenge that decision. My client made the disclosure without expending a lot of time and without spending any money. Without the consents, though, my client would have had a difficult time, especially if elders had died since the research was completed. It would have raised a number of thorny questions. Does my client need to get consent at all if the elder has died? Or does my client need the elder's family's consent? Consent to the community? Or does my client have to go to court to get court approval to disclose? In this case, because of proper records management and the use of legal consents permitting secondary use, we didn't have to deal with any of that. Problem solved, my client was happy, everyone was happy. So this slide goes on to talk about how IT can support data. IT is a key worker, a key player in this process. They can create folders on the structured share drive. They can provide appropriate hardware. They can also advise the IG steering committee regarding reviews of software options for handling the data, and they can review the infrastructure of the IT system to leverage data gathering.
So let's think about where we could find well-being data. So I have an example for you. So what we're going to be looking for is the number of post-secondary tuitions that are paid for during a fiscal year. So let's assume that an Indigenous government wants to know how many of their citizens received post-secondary funding. Now, this is coming out of the executive director doing a risk analysis of what percentage of her staff are set to retire within the next 5 years. And she was absolutely dismayed to realize that over 50% of her administrative staff can retire within the next 5 years. So she said to her team on the steering committee, how can we find our graduates so that we can attempt to recruit them back to the government? So they decided that the first thing that they would do is they would go and look at the financial software, because that was really their only format of electronic reporting, because the education department is all in paper. So the very first thing that they did is they took a look at their records map, and they realized that although they could go to education, the electronic records could be mostly at finance. So they're looking to see, okay, what type of software has finance used over the years? And then where is my target years that I want to find viable graduates from? So it's important to understand the life cycle of specific data. For example, you may not have the original software that started collecting the data that you're looking for. So here's a nice kind of chart that I can start you off with that will demonstrate what we're talking about. So from 1973 to 91, which is 18 years, the finance department operated only in paper. There was no software. Now, CRA requires a 7-year retention on financial records. So it is completely possible that those records for that 18 years may not be available in paper. In 1991, the finance department got QuickBooks, and they ran that software until 2008. So that is 17 years of electronic records that are in a QuickBooks software. The only problem is that in 2008, Sage software was bought. and is currently their running software. QuickBooks, portions of it were migrated into Sage, and then QuickBooks was taken off the server. So those electronic records are also not available. So now we have 13 years of records in electronic format that we could run a report on that's in Sage, and we may be able to access, 7 years of paper financial records. But the records that she was really looking for, if they're going through their disposition properly, they're gone. So it's really important to understand your formats of what format your records could be in, and then where they would be, and then your secondary sources when you find that you may actually have disposition holes in your record sets that you're hoping to get the data from.
So in conclusion, we have 3 main recommendations for you. First, use standards and best practices to ensure you're conducting your research is the best way to do things for you. Second, before you start your research, assess your government's profile for governance and business. That way you know what laws apply to you and what business you conduct in order to ensure you're creating the right information, can give it to the right people at the right time. Third, since your government may have a wealth of administrative data, before you start your research, map your information assets to find out what you have. Mapping both your government's paper and electronic records will provide you with a complete picture. Bobby and I thank you for your attention today. We would be pleased to take any questions you may have or listen to your comments about what we've said today.
Thank you both so much. That was a lot of information covered in a short amount of time. I think it was clear to me anyway that you both have done a lot of work in thinking about both conceptual frameworks as well as very practical frameworks and tools that I think folks that are on the line today and their colleagues can use in their context. If there are questions, feel free to jump them into the chat. We're gonna otherwise take a break. I did want to just take a second to note that there's kind of 2 sources for tools on this probably. There's the Toolkit, the Indigenous Data Governance Toolkit. Some of the tools I understand are in different stages of being uploaded to that site. So if you don't see something right away, loop back later. So for example, all of that content that Bobby and Stuart started out with respect to standards, there'll be a bit of a summary of all the standards available to you and links to those standards. So those tools are still being developed and will be uploaded to the site. And then there's the First Nations Public Service Secretariat RIM toolkit. There's, I think, 2 parts to that toolkit, and I popped the link to that in the chat, somewhere lost in the chat in the middle there. There is a question in the chat. Is it ethical to look up information on citizens through payments made to them? So tuition, for example, or some sort of contract. Is it ethical to look up information on them through payments made to them?
What we want to have, first of all, is when the student gives the information, the student signs a consent form that allows the government to make use of the information for a specific use. And it's the best practice to list those specific uses. And it may include things like research. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't, though, the typical principle is that in privacy law that we consent for a specific use. And if it's not listed in a written consent, then it's for that one use. So if you're looking up information for the purpose not related to the original collection, or there's no consent that lists all the different uses that you can look up the information, you may be in danger of a privacy breach and subject to a privacy complaint if the citizen finds out about information being examined and maybe even shared in a way that's contrary to the original use and collection and consent, and that can get folks into trouble. I like to talk about this as the grandmother principle. If you have information about people, would you want people talking about your grandmother's information, her personal information? And if the answer is no, you're probably not doing the right things.
Yeah, the point about like thinking at the beginning about consent models, I think ties in closely with what we heard from Hannes and Rebecca at the last session about take the time at the beginning of any data collection effort to plan before doing. Because thinking about, and your example was really interesting one, Stuart, about 20 years later, all of a sudden we need that data for a different purpose. And if you didn't kind of really think big at the beginning of that process, like whoever was involved in that initial consent process for that client was very forward looking to have
Very
included that
smart. Yeah.
purpose. Very smart person. That's right.
So share that story, tell that story. I was skeptical. I didn't think we would get the consents, but there they were. It was written in very plain language. The elders had the consent explained to them. Some of them didn't speak English, so it explained to them in their own language, and there was no conflict. There's no problem with the community. So it was a really great success story. And the best thing about it, from the government's point of view, is it didn't take a lot of time and it didn't have to spend any money.
Mhm.